The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, known widely as GERD, is not just a piece of infrastructure. It is a symbol of Ethiopia's ambitions. Rising from the Benishangul-Gumuz region near the Blue Nile, the project has been described as the crown jewel of the country's development. Construction began in the year 2011 and, after more than a decade of work, Ethiopia officially inaugurated the dam in September of 2025. It stands nearly 170 meters tall and stretches close to 2 kilometers across, making it the largest hydroelectric power plant on the African continent. What makes the GERD unique is not only its size, but how it was funded. Unlike many large infrastructure projects that rely on international loans, the Renaissance Dam was largely financed through contributions from Ethiopian citizens, bonds, and state revenues. This gave it the weight of a national project, seen as a matter of sovereignty and pride. For Ethiopia, the dam is meant to double the nation's electricity production, supply power to millions who have lived without reliable energy, and even allow exports of electricity to neighboring countries. Behind its concrete walls lies a vast reservoir with a capacity of about 74 billion cubic meters of water. To put that in perspective, it is a man-made lake large enough to cover an area bigger than the entire city of London. For Ethiopia, that reservoir represents stored energy, economic opportunity, and a chance to lift millions out of poverty. But downstream in Sudan and Egypt, the same body of water is viewed with deep unease. The Nile is more than just a river to those countries, it is their lifeline. Egypt, home to over 100 million people, depends on the Nile for more than 90% of its fresh water. Sudan relies on it for agriculture and survival as well. To both nations, the GERD carries the possibility of altering the flow of this ancient river. And while diplomatic disputes over water rights and old colonial-era treaties have dominated headlines, an even darker possibility lurks behind it all. If the dam were ever to fail, whether through accident, natural disaster, or even sabotage, the consequences would unfold on a scale almost too vast to imagine. This is the hidden danger of the Renaissance Dam, a project built as a promise of progress, but shadowed by the risk of catastrophe. And in the scenario we are exploring, that shadow becomes reality. It begins without warning. In this hypothetical scenario, the towering wall of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam suddenly gives way. Concrete fractures, water roars, and 74 billion cubic meters of stored Nile water surge forward with unstoppable force. Within seconds, what had been a calm reservoir transforms into a tidal wave of destruction. The energy released is equal to several nuclear bombs, but instead of fire and smoke, it is water and chaos. The first to feel the impact would be the communities closest to the dam site. Entire villages along the Blue Nile would be swept away before a single warning could be sounded. Roads, bridges, and farmland would vanish beneath walls of water, moving faster than a person could run. The shockwave would obliterate power lines and communication systems, leaving survivors cut off in the dark. As the flood races downstream, Sudan becomes the next victim. Towns and cities built along the Nile would be overwhelmed within hours. The capital, Khartoum, sitting at the confluence of the Blue and White Nile, would face one of the worst urban floods in modern history. Buildings would collapse, infrastructure would fail, and millions would be forced to flee with nowhere to go. Beyond Sudan, the wave of destruction would continue its march northward toward Egypt. The Nile, usually steady and life-giving, would turn into a raging torrent. Fields that once grew wheat and vegetables would be drowned, villages buried in mud, and ancient sites along the river damaged beyond repair. Even the massive Aswan High Dam could be placed under strain, tested as never before. In only a matter of hours, the entire course of the Nile, from Ethiopia to Egypt, would be transformed. What had once been the foundation of civilizations for thousands of years would become a corridor of devastation, and yet this would only be the beginning. The breach itself is just the spark. What follows are the long-term consequences that no nation could fully prepare for. In this hypothetical disaster, the true devastation is measured not just in collapsed bridges and flooded farmland, but in the lives upended. Millions of people across Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt depend directly on the Nile for water, food, and survival. When the dam breaks, their homes, villages, and entire communities would be swept away in hours. Families would be scattered, with countless forced to flee toward higher ground carrying only what they could grab in moments of chaos. Sudan would likely face the greatest immediate displacement. Cities like Khartoum and Omdurman could see hundreds of thousands of residents stranded, with roads cut off and supply chains severed. Hospitals would be overwhelmed within days. not only by injuries from the flood, but by outbreaks of water-borne disease spreading through polluted floodwaters. Drinking water supplies would collapse, forcing survivors to rely on unsafe sources that increase the risk of cholera and other deadly illnesses. In Egypt, the crisis would play out differently, but with no less urgency. The Nile supports nearly the entire population of the country, and sudden disruption to its flow would cripple water distribution networks. Crops vital for daily food supplies would be destroyed, leaving millions at risk of hunger. Refugee flows from Sudan would surge northward, creating political and humanitarian strain on a nation already managing high population density. Beyond the immediate region, the human cost would spill across borders. International aid organizations would struggle to deliver assistance as destroyed infrastructure blocks entry into the hardest hit zones. Camps would form rapidly, but overcrowding and lack of sanitation would add to the suffering. The sheer scale of the crisis would push global relief systems to their limits. This wave of human suffering highlights the reality that a dam break is never only about physical destruction. It is about destabilizing entire societies, leaving millions without security, shelter, or hope. And as the survivors fight for survival in the aftermath, the political and economic consequences of this catastrophe would soon come into focus. As the floodwaters recede, the hypothetical disaster would shift from an environmental and humanitarian catastrophe to an intense political crisis. Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt have long-standing fragile agreements over Nile water usage, and the dam's failure would instantly shatter decades of negotiation. Ethiopia would face international scrutiny and anger for what is perceived as negligence, even if the breach was caused by natural factors beyond human control. Regional stability would be at risk, with neighbors demanding accountability and reparations for the unprecedented loss of life and property. Sudan, reeling from the destruction of the Gezira Plain and the collapse of downstream dams, would confront political turmoil. The government would struggle to maintain control as millions of displaced citizens compete for dwindling resources. Local authorities in Khartoum and other major cities would face immense pressure to provide shelter, food, and security, all while attempting to prevent civil unrest. Egypt's reliance on the Nile for over 90% of its freshwater would place the country in an extremely vulnerable position. The emergency releases from the Aswan High Dam, intended to prevent its own collapse, would lead to widespread flooding along the Nile Valley. Agricultural regions, some of the most fertile in the world, would be devastated, triggering food shortages and threatening the livelihoods of millions of farmers. Diplomatic relations with Ethiopia would reach a breaking point, as the Egyptian government demands international intervention and compensation. International organizations would be drawn into the crisis. The United Nations, the African Union, and humanitarian agencies would scramble to coordinate relief, mediate disputes, and deliver aid across borders. The global community would be forced to confront the cascading effects of infrastructure failure on diplomacy, regional security, and economic stability. Ultimately, the political fallout of a gerd breach would rival the physical devastation. Governments would be under immense pressure from both domestic populations and international observers. The failure of a single engineering project could redefine the balance of power in Northeast Africa, leaving nations politically fractured while the human toll continues to mount. Within days, the waters from the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, joined by the collapsed Rosaires and Sennar dams in Sudan, would surge northward along the Nile toward Egypt. The Aswan High Dam, Egypt's last major line of defense, would face unprecedented pressure. Although it is a colossal structure, it was never designed to withstand a sudden, massive pulse of water originating from hundreds of kilometers upstream. Emergency releases from its spillways would be necessary to prevent structural failure, but these measures would only shift the disaster downstream. Cities along the Nile, including Luxor, Aswan, and Kena, would experience severe flooding. Streets, homes, and farmlands could be submerged under several meters of water, displacing millions of residents. Agricultural infrastructure that sustains much of Egypt's food supply would be destroyed or rendered unusable. The inundation of croplands would also lead to soil degradation and the loss of planting cycles, causing long-term food insecurity. The humanitarian impact would be catastrophic. Millions would require immediate evacuation, shelter, and medical attention, with the spread of waterborne diseases such as cholera becoming a severe threat. Access to clean drinking water and sanitation would collapse in affected areas, compounding the public health crisis. Meanwhile, transportation networks along the Nile would be rendered impassable. slowing relief efforts and preventing efficient distribution of aid. Economically, Egypt would face crippling losses. The flooding would destroy homes, businesses, and essential infrastructure, potentially setting back development by decades. Insurance systems and government emergency funds would be overwhelmed, while the international community would be called upon for both financial and logistical support. The cascading disaster would also have geopolitical consequences. Tensions between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia would escalate as each nation seeks to protect its population while assigning blame for the devastation. International mediation would be essential, yet complex, as the scale of destruction makes cooperative solutions increasingly difficult. By the end of the first week, the initial floodwaters would have reshaped the Nile Valley in both Sudan and Egypt. Entire communities would be displaced, fertile lands submerged, and the very fabric of regional stability shaken. The gerd, intended as a symbol of progress, would instead stand as a monument to the immense risks inherent in massive infrastructure projects. In the months following the dam collapse, the scale of destruction across Northeast Africa becomes painfully clear. In Sudan, the devastation of the Gezira plain has destroyed nearly 40% of the nation's agricultural land, leaving millions at risk of famine. Displaced populations crowd into makeshift camps along higher ground, struggling with limited food, shelter, and sanitation. Outbreaks of waterborne diseases such as cholera and dysentery spread rapidly, overwhelming the already strained healthcare system. Egypt faces long-term consequences as well. Emergency releases from the Aswan High Dam would have caused severe soil erosion and degradation of farmland along the Nile, diminishing crop yields for multiple growing seasons. Cities like Luxor and Aswan would face months of cleanup and reconstruction, with damaged infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and ports limiting economic recovery. The disruption to irrigation networks would further exacerbate the agricultural crisis, leaving millions dependent on food aid. Environmental damage is profound. Fish populations and river ecosystems are decimated, and sediment displacement alters the natural course of the Nile. Wetlands and riparian zones along the river suffer catastrophic habitat loss, affecting countless species. In some areas, chemical pollutants and debris left behind by the floods contaminate soil and water for years, threatening both human and ecological health. Politically, the disaster reshapes regional relationships. Ethiopia's reputation suffers as the gerd, once a symbol of national pride, becomes a source of international conflict. Sudan and Egypt demand accountability, and diplomatic tensions intensify. Efforts to rebuild trust and negotiate water sharing agreements are slow and fraught with mistrust. The economic cost is staggering. Billions of dollars are lost in infrastructure, agriculture, and property, and the region's development is set back decades. International aid is essential, but logistical challenges and political disputes slow the delivery of relief. Communities must rely heavily on local resources and ingenuity to survive. For the people who survive, life is transformed. Urban centers along the Nile are partially abandoned, while rural areas struggle to recover. Basic services like electricity, healthcare, and clean water are limited or absent. Social structures are tested, and new systems of local governance and community cooperation emerge out of necessity. The dam's failure leaves a permanent scar on Northeast Africa. The Blue Nile's course, local topography, and regional ecosystems are forever changed. What was intended as a symbol of progress and prosperity becomes a stark lesson in the risks of massive infrastructure projects. Ultimately, the collapse of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam serves as a reminder of the delicate balance between human ambition and nature's forces. It shows how one catastrophic failure can ripple across borders, devastate populations, and alter the course of history. In the wake of the disaster, the region is forced to confront the limits of control, resilience, and cooperation.